All right. Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our random standalone component spike with Alex Rickabaugh. So I just saw that I don't even think he was talking about it. I think somebody else was talking about something that Alex was working on, and it just looked really cool. So I reached out to him and I said, I know you're not finished with this yet, but can you just like come and hang out with us and nerd out? And he said yes. And here he is. So I'm just gonna turn it over to Alex. And Alex, I'll let you take the floor and everybody, this is Alex Rickabaugh.
Yeah, hello. Nice to see everyone, meet everyone. So yeah, those of you who pay attention to the Angular roadmap that's on Angular IO may have noticed that a few months ago there was a project added to our kind of future upcoming section there talking about optional ng modules. And if you kept an eye on that page, you probably noticed fairly recently it shifted from future project to in progress project. So this is something we've actually, it's an effort that we've kicked off to explore this idea and this design space. And as part of that exploration, I ended up just to kind of verify some assumptions about how an implementation might work in our compiler today. I did a little spike PR just saying like, okay, here's the kinds of changes that we need to make. Here's what it looks like for a component to declare its own dependencies. And I somewhat just pulled the name Standalone Components out of my hat. And so I kind of pushed the PR up and I linked it. We have a Slack channel for this effort where we talk.
It's a very catchy name.
Yeah, it really is. So I linked it to the team, like, hey, we were talking about, would it be possible to implement this thing? It took me like 2 or 3 hours to just go and do that. So here, proof it's possible. What I did not expect was that people who watch the Angular GitHub repository would see that draft PR and get really excited about it. So I think I published it kind of late in the day one day, and I went to bed and woke up the next morning, and Emma from our developer relations team had linked, oh, people are tweeting about this like draft PR that you have. That was very surprising.
That's what happened when I put this post up. I didn't even tweet about it. I was like, let's just have a cozy chat with Alex. We won't even tell anybody. And then Eris tweeted about it, and then Manfred retweeted it, and then everybody showed up. It's like, well, I guess they're excited about this, Alex.
Yeah, it's great to see. Also kind of scary because we're still trying to figure out what the heck we're doing, and so it's fantastic to see all of this interest. So I can talk a little bit about
pressure.
Yeah, no, none whatsoever. I can talk a little bit, I guess, about the project itself and what it is and what it isn't. And I'll be very clear here that this is more of an area of research at the moment than a concrete implementation plan. We are looking at various design possibilities, starting from the question, like the phrase optional ng modules kind of implies maybe in some circumstances you wouldn't need an ng module to do something that you would do with one today. And this turns out to be a really challenging question or a really challenging space to explore because ng modules do so many things. And so we've kind of ended up focusing in on, can we make applications less boilerplatey? So that's the kind of current thrust of our research is, are there ways in which we could allow an application developer to maybe not need to write so many ng modules, regardless, depending on how they've structured their application, where the modules aren't really adding as much value. And we think the answer might be yes. It remains to be seen whether the benefits outweigh the drawbacks in that case. Obviously, we're adding something to the framework that makes your mental model a little bit more complex in certain cases and simplifies it in others. And that's a balance that we have to explore and understand, what the trade-offs are there. So what do ng modules do, right, is kind of one of the first things that we have to understand here. Because they're different things to different parts of the application. And even like on the Angular team ourselves, my view of ng modules as a concept, my mental model of how they work with the framework has changed significantly in the last 3 months since we've been talking about this. And I find this fascinating. And I think it's one of the things we really didn't expect when we designed them back in Angular 2.0. And it kind of goes to show just how interesting of a concept it is that Angular developers, including people on the team, can use these things every day and not really fully understand how they're actually interacting with each other and with the rest of the system. So I think I'd like to just ask, I recognize some people in here who I know have thought about this problem quite a bit. So I won't call on any names yet, but I'd like to ask a question for people to think about. What does it mean?
I know at least one person who has opinions.
Yeah. He might or may not be wearing a red shirt.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah, so what does it mean to put a component in an ng module's declarations? That's a question I'd like to hear a few opinions on, if someone feels interested in sharing.
So I would say, I would say what I thought previously, because I just met with you about kind of this kind of stuff not that long ago, and you showed me a really cool trick. But before that, I would say that declaring them in the ng module is where it would like bootstrap the component so that it would kind of package it up and get it ready to go. But I'm not saying that because I know, I'm just saying that because nobody else is answering and I'm guessing.
I'm just giving some people some time to answer this question.
Aditya says scoping.
Scoping, ahead, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Okay,
if you want to unmute and
Aditya, do you want to? Yeah, Aditya knows what he's talking about. He's already done a couple of tech talks for us, and he's amazing. Aditya, why are you being so shy, my friend? All right, well, let's go to Aristides and then come back to Aditya.
Hello, Alex. Thanks very much for being here today. I was looking forward for this talk. So for me, put some components into declarations of a module is more of a grouping. Because I always thought that the basic building block in Angular is the component, not the module. Module, my opinion, is that they are only for grouping components under one umbrella, right? So we have single cohesive functionality for all components into one module. So this is what I like to think of as a grouping only.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So people may know that I've worked on the Angular compiler for the last few years. And in the compiler, scoping is kind of the biggest thing that ng modules do. So when you put a component in the declarations of an ng module, you're actually telling the compiler, when you look at this component's template, you have to go to that module to figure out what all the directives and pipes and other components that you're allowed to use are. So when you add a component to declarations, you're saying this module is now managing this component's template in some way and giving access to certain other utilities like ngIf, ng4, etc. You also use the word grouping, which I find really interesting. And we'll go into more about that in a few minutes. I want to hear from a couple other people.
I think Aditya should have his mic on now.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Barely.
I'll also say that the scoping was probably my answer before we started this whole effort. I would have said, oh yeah, ng modules control the scope of a component. And also this idea of grouping where we have common module in Angular, and it's a convenient way to import ngIf and ng4 and async pipe and everything, without having to list them all out explicitly. So having a group of things that I can depend on instead of having to name everything, everything that I want to use.
Hello.
Oh, much better. Yeah, there you go, sir.
Aditya!
Hey all.
Hey. We
So
can hear you. This is very exciting.
My understanding is that basically what a component needs, like what are its dependencies and how the components are going to interact with the dependencies. So less just letting the maybe compiler know that these are the stuff that these components would need. So you have to, that is my basic understanding, I think.
That's what I said too, but you guys explained it way better than I did.
Yeah, what a component needs. I like that answer. That's also really interesting for some subtle reasons. I'm going to go ahead and call on you directly now, Saunders.
You're muted, Sander.
Better so?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, modules are indeed used for scoping and grouping and all kinds of things. The only problem I really have with them is that they are really a strange thing in the whole hierarchy. Angular is a component framework, and there is a component hierarchy, and then this component uses that component, and that component uses that component. And where do I fit the module in this mental picture? And also it does the, how you call it, reverse thing with the dependencies. So you want to use the ngIf in this component, and that means you have to add it in this module over there that doesn't fit in my mental picture of the whole tree of my application, which is confusing as hell, especially for beginners. And I think that's the confusing part is the biggest problem that Angular has for beginners.
So this issue is, as Sander pointed out, where if your component depends on something, you don't actually add that dependency to the component. You find the module that's declaring the component and add the dependency there. That indirection is very confusing for people who are just learning Angular for the first time. It kind of makes sense for people who, all of us who've worked with ng modules for a while. You get used to it and become second nature. It's also really confusing.
There is a term for that, Stockholm syndrome.
Yes. It's also really confusing for build tooling. We call this the backwards arrow problem, because tools like Webpack and like Cursor that do tree shaking optimizations that are so important for getting your code size down. If you import common module, but common module has like 15 different pipes in it. There's the JSON pipe, there's the number pipe, the date pipe, async pipe, etc. If you only use a couple of those, the other ones need to get removed. But in order to do that, the tree shaker needs to be able to look at a component and say, okay, I can see it's using X and Y, but not Z. It's using date pipe and JSON pipe, but not the async pipe. And so I can drop async pipe. The problem is the way the code is actually written, that information is not available to the tree shaker. The tree shaker can't see what the component is depending on because that's over in the module, and the component doesn't actually depend on the module, it's the other way around. So there's no chain of references for the tree shaker to follow or not follow and know what's not used. So one of the compiler's main jobs is rewriting those dependency arrows so that the component actually does directly reference everything it depends on. And so that's why it's kind of a really attractive idea to just have the component do that directly without a module in the middle. So let me tell you all some of the things that I've learned about ng modules while talking about this project. So Demalia, go ahead.
Hey, hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
We can hear you, Demalia. Hello.
Hello. So I was wondering this thing that, there is this craze about smaller bundle sizes. And if I compare with a framework like React, they don't have ngIf or ngFor, just write JavaScript ifs and fors. So how does Angular, having all these, like you said, we have common module that has all these 50 different pipes, but we don't use them all. But we still have the common module imported. How does Angular bring down the size, which is like comparable to React component, while still having this problem?
Yeah, great question. The answer is that when Angular's compiler runs, it essentially rewrites your components to look more like React does. That is to directly reference their dependencies. And so when your ng module imports common module, it tells the compiler, oh, async pipe is available in this template, JSON pipe is available, ngIf, ngFor, ngSwitch, etc. Depending on what your template actually uses, when the compiler generates the code for that template, it will directly reference ngIf, ngFor if they're used. But if you don't use ngSwitch, it's not going to reference ngSwitch. And so by the time the code gets to Webpack, that's actually doing the bundling and the tree shaking, it looks kind of like a React component does, where you're just directly calling the functions for any child components or higher order things that you're trying to do. So the tree shaker is actually able to follow that. So the ng modules, I like to say, like they melt away in terms of component scoping.
Which kind of brings to my next question. If that can be done, then why do we import common module at all? Couldn't common module just be there available? And if the compiler already knows during compile time, why do we have to explicitly import all the modules? If the compiler already knows that, this is not being used, so it'll throw away the rest of the stuff anyway.
That's a great question, with a fairly complicated answer. So there's kind of conceptual design principles, right? Which that Angular is generally opinionated in being explicit over implicit. So we try not to have magic that happens in the background. We try to have you explicitly declare what you're interested in, what you want to do. So having kind of, when you add a component to an ng module, that's an explicit declaration that this component is going to be scoped by this module. And then in that module, you specify what things you want to add to that scope. That's like common module, that's forms, material, etc. And our compiler is able to figure that out. If you didn't have that, you would need some other way of telling the compiler, what are all of the things in the universe that I want to be available? Common module is an obvious one because ngIf and ngFor are like, built-in utilities almost. But we don't necessarily know that you want to use material in your application. And the way that TypeScript actually works, if nothing references material, it's not even going to get loaded. The compiler won't even know that it exists. So having that reference is necessary in order for our compiler to understand at all that like something is even available to be used. The other kind of nice feature of this is you can do encapsulation and scoping on an application level. So, just because you have two libraries that have a directive that happens to have the same selector doesn't mean that you want that selector to match every component in your application. Right? Maybe part of your application is using forms from one package, part of your application is using forms from another, and you don't necessarily want a disabled directive to apply to both. So being able to say, I want only this module and all of the components inside of it to see this directive is really powerful, especially when you get into much bigger and bigger applications.
Right. Thanks, Alex.
No problem. We have a question about how does it affect compilation time? Generally, it doesn't. It would actually be more expensive, I think, for the compiler to like scan your node modules and find everything that you might be able to reference implicitly in a template. It's much better if you tell us about that, and then we can do a very limited amount of work to understand the structure of your template. And yeah, tree shaking is really the central design goal of Ivy. The idea was to make to merge ng factories into the components themselves, so that the tree shaker has a much easier time understanding the structure of Angular components. Because before that, it kind of worked until you got into like the entry components and the ng or the component factor resolver case, and then things kind of fell apart there. So with Ivy, tree shaking is much more natural and just sort of works.
I just want to jump in here real quick and say that I know this might be kind of an advanced topic that we're talking about, but it affects all of us, and you do not have to be an expert to ask Alex questions at all. That's one of the things I like about Alex.
Yeah, so
I would ask you if you didn't answer all of his questions just while he sits there.
We've talked about ng modules for scoping, and we've talked about a little bit about ng modules for grouping, like importing common module instead of having to explicitly ask for ngF and ng4 and everything separately. Grouping has another interesting property, which I consider to be distinct, which is encapsulation. And those of us who are working on optional ng modules, everyone will kind of laugh at me because I always bring up forms module in discussions as an example of this. Forms module, the template-driven forms, you interact with through like ng model directive. And you put the ng model directive on an input, and you're able to like do two-way binding, and it participates in your form, and we all know how to do that. What you may not realize is that when you import forms module, you get the ng model directive, but you also get these things called the control value accessor directives. And there's one called default control value accessor. There's one called checkbox control value accessor, I think. And these are kind of internal glue that's needed to make inputs work with ng model. So when you have an input ng model in a form, that actually not only has the ng model directive, it has this control value accessor directive on it. You as a user did not even need to know that that was a thing, right? It's kind of an internal API for how forms works. And if you're writing your own form control, then you start dealing with that. But because we're imported forms module, we didn't have to think about these extra directives. We call them cooperating directives that are needed for forms to work, right? So if you imported ng model directly, it wouldn't work because you wouldn't know that you needed these other things to kind of cooperate with ng model and make the form actually work. So ng modules give us a way, it gives library authors a way to encapsulate a bunch of functionality and offer an API of components and directives that are intended for users to put on their elements and use in their templates, but also directives and pipes and things in the background that might match against certain kinds of HTML elements or attributes or something like that. That users don't necessarily need to think about explicitly. And that's really powerful and is been a hard concept to design outside of this. Go ahead, Sander.
Alex, can you explain the difference between a barrel and an ng module? Because I think those are related, but slightly different. And I think you can explain.
Yeah, so by barrel, you mean like an ECMAScript file that re-exports a bunch of things.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're very related in that they are both just generally containers and give visibility into one or more things. So you could imagine that like we could have designed ng module as just an ES module reference that had certain properties, or we treated the exports in a certain way. But having it be a class with a decorator kind of fits into the Angular ecosystem a little bit better. And it allows us to have other concepts besides just import and export. So I'm kind of surprised that no one has mentioned ng modules have providers. They are also how you configure dependency injection in Angular. So you build your app module. Your app module imports other modules. Maybe you have feature modules. Maybe you use the scam pattern. I can't get over how much I love that name. That's the single component Angular module, where you have one ng module for every component, just a one-to-one mapping. But when you bootstrap your application at runtime, we collect the providers from all of the ng modules that are transitively dependent on by your app module, and those become your application injector. And so any services that are needed by any of the components in your app are configured that way. And then when you use the router and you lazy load some other part of your application, we create a new injector that has the providers that are defined by those modules, which is a child of the application injector. And so ng modules are also managing DI in the background. And for the longest time, I thought of these two concepts as distinct. That ng modules managed component scopes and ng modules managed providers. And it was weird to me that these two things, which seem to have very different life cycles, right? One is concerned with like, how does a component get its dependencies when it's created at a component, when the component is actually instantiated. And the other is concerned with like, what are we dumping into the application injector at the application bootstrap time? So these seem like very different life cycles, very different concerns. And talking to different Angular developers as well, like people seem to have some concept of some of these things, but not really. A lot of people hadn't really thought about how they fit together, including myself. So this was kind of a realization for me. Kai.
For me, the providers in modules kind of, I exchanged providing things in modules when Angular introduced the provided in decorator property. So nowadays it's for me just either provide something in the component scope, so the service lives with my component, dies with my component, or I provide it in root and globally, kind of. So I don't see use case, or I hadn't had a use case where I still need a provider on a module level.
Go ahead.
I can almost guarantee you do have such providers in your application, because that's how the router actually works. So if you do router module for root or for child and you give it a list of routes, you are actually configuring a provider in the application module. So even when it's not really obvious, you're not actually writing providers out on an ng module, you're still using that concept of including providers in the application injector that get rolled up through all of the ng modules.
By the way, Alex, have you met Kai Roeder?
I believe we've interacted in previous iterations.
I was gonna say he's our resident storybook expert. Yeah. He's amazing. We like him a lot. It's cool people. All right, let's not get mushy. Let's keep moving.
I think people are not thinking about providers in modules because of the provider in root nowadays, which is why we mostly forget. And also, it doesn't fit in the whole tree mental model of your application. So that makes the module, where does it go in my tree, which is, again, a problem thinking about this and reasoning about this thing. So it becomes a little bit easier with the scam. But if you are using scam modules, you can just as well provide them in the component itself.
Yeah, I agree. So these two concepts, though, like providers and scoping, are tied in by another kind of conceptual point about ng modules. And it's always funny in these conversations. I end up saying the word ng modules so many times. So it turns out ng modules are how you manage a component scope. But also, there is no way in Angular currently to depend on a component or a directive or a pipe without going through an ng module. And it seems like these are two sides of the same coin, but there's some important distinctions there. By forcing you to go through an ng module, we actually give the author of a library that someone's trying to use, like Material or ng Bootstrap or something like that, the opportunity to control what components or directives you get to see. That's that like grouping and encapsulation, but also to control what providers are in the application. So the ng module can have a contract and say, I am guaranteeing that if you import this ng module, you will be correctly configured to use whatever component or thing that I'm doing. So Forms module works that way, right? Forms module not only has the extra directives that you don't know that you need, you don't have to add yourself. It also has providers. And so if you add Forms module to your application, you are getting the right providers in order to make that work. We do have tree shakeable providers these days. So there is a kind of better alternative, but there's a lot of ng modules out there that still use this pattern. They still provide something that's needed for the components that they're also giving you visibility over to function correctly. And so this is kind of the key challenge that we've been tossing around for the last last few months, is if we wanted to do something where a component could exist without an ng module and participate in the application, how do we deal with the fact that ng modules are how the world works today? And how do we preserve all of these guarantees that they give you about encapsulation and having the right set of dependencies? How do we make these two worlds interoperable without creating mass confusion? So that you know as a user, when you pull down a library, how I'm supposed to depend on this library. Do I import components directly? Is there an ng module I'm supposed to go through? Right? We want to make it so there's no wrong way to depend on something, that you don't end up with these weird cases where your application doesn't work the way it should because you imported something the wrong way and you missed a provider or you missed a directive that was supposed to be there. That turns out to be a really hard problem to solve. We have some hands up. Ankita? And please tell me if I'm saying your name wrong.
No, you said it right. Hi, and thank you. I joined late, so I just wanted to also thank you again for taking time. So one thing that, at least in my mental model, especially, I don't know, like this might be because I work with NX, that we have feature components and UI kit components, where feature are smart components and UI kit are presentational. So all the presentational dumb components always follow the SCAM methodology. They're all single module, but the feature components might not be, because you might not, because they're all in their libraries, the feature component of their library, so you might not want to expose. And that's how I think of modules, that modules can basically tell you what the component needs, right? So you might not want to expose what the component is importing. And so for me, it's like kind of encapsulation kind of a thing happening for feature components, that you might have all these child components inside it, and even if it's material components, so you have like declarations, imports and exports that are all defined in each module, and you might not want to export everything that's defined in it. So I was just wondering, how would that be different if we completely get rid of modules? If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is this property of encapsulation, or another way to think about it is it lets you as a library author, who are trying to provide some reusable components or directives for an application, it really lets you design what your API should be. So you're saying, I want to expose these things. I want these things to be internal implementation details. I want these directives to be available, but maybe they match automatically and the user doesn't actually know about it. You know, this happens in Material a lot as well, where you have like material tabs. And material tabs is like 3 or 4 different components that form like a domain-specific language, like a little DSL you have for writing tabs. And really the user just wants to use tabs and not think about the fact that this is actually 4 different things that are split apart. So the current understanding, or at least the current feeling of the team, is that Angular is always going to need a way to do this. Encapsulation is a super important property of designing a library. And we can't have a world where this goes away, or libraries aren't able to say, like, I want to provide a set of things and a curated experience for how developers are going to depend on that. Chow, I do not, unfortunately, have a live demo for you. I'm not sure it would be particularly interesting, and also I'm going to be I'm going to be very careful talking about any proposed syntax, unfortunately, just because all of our discussions right now are essentially straw man arguments. So we have some idea of like what syntax we think is reasonable that we use to talk about the ideas, but we're really mainly looking at the concepts at the moment. Like what concept, what abstraction can we add, and how does that abstraction interact with all of the other things going on in Angular? What does it mean for the mental models of someone who's new to the framework and just getting started learning? Someone who's writing a library, what does it mean for someone who's really experienced? How do existing applications start adopting this incrementally? What kinds of refactorings do they have to do? Edward asks, do I need a providers array in ng module if my services are defined with provided in? No, you do not. I will say that if I could change one thing about ng modules today, just wave a wand and update the entire ecosystem at once, it would probably be to move providers out of ng modules and have them be a separate concept. And Ivy is actually built this way internally. So if you look at the compiled output of an ng module, it has 2 static fields, one of which tells the runtime about the component scoping, and the other tells the runtime about provider scoping. And so the 2 concepts are kind of dealt with separately, but both derive from the ng module decorator. So in, I would say, like 95+% of cases, provided in root is what you should be using for any generic service. There are cases where you're doing more custom things, something like the router, where there are providers that are trying to just say, like, this is a thing that needs to be injectable, and that's provided in root, and that's 95% of the cases. Then there are providers where you're really saying, like, I'm a library that needs some piece of information that I don't know up front. Maybe it's for the router, it's like what routes are in your application. You could imagine for like a data API library, it's like, what's the base URL of the data server that I'm talking to? Material has some providers that deal with like theming or things like that. A good example is ng Bootstrap has a provider for what calendar system are we using, where the default value is a Gregorian calendar, but you can like override that if you want to show other styles. So there's the providing services and there's providing configuration. And I think provided in root addresses services, and for configuration, I could imagine another concept where you would configure injectors for the application kind of separately. Aristides.
Yeah, I'm really interested to learn what's in optional ng modules for the framework itself, because I understand that optional ng modules is a must, is a feature that is going to the consumer of the framework, but how the framework itself is going to benefit from that, or what are some caveats that there will be after making ng modules optional?
Yeah, so the context in which we're currently discussing this right now is, can we make writing an application less boilerplatey? I've written Angular apps, and I know I'm not the only one who's felt this, that like it's kind of a chore every time I make a new component to have to either answer the question, what module do I put it in? or if I'm using something like Scam, to go ahead and create a new ng module just for that component. And it's really annoying in the CLI, for example, because the default is to have ng modules be completely separate from components. And so it's like doubling the number of files that I need, doubling the number of tabs I need open my IDE just to be kind of managing these things. So, you know, that to me is just boilerplate that doesn't necessarily need to be there. And so I don't think we're like nearly ready to start talking about, you know, removing ng modules from Angular or anything like that. Like, they are solving a number of problems. They're well known in the community. I don't think we'll get to a point where we say it's time to, you know, we'll be able to replace them with something else anytime soon. But there are cases where they're not adding a lot of value. You're not designing a shared library with reusable components where you're trying to like very carefully encapsulate which things you want people to depend on, which things you need them to depend on together, right? You're just writing an app. You're just writing kind of business logic components. And ng modules really aren't providing a ton of value in that scenario. And so our first goal is kind of, can we have a concept in the framework of a component that doesn't need an ng module to exist and work within the rest of the app? And that necessitates being able to participate in the ng module ecosystem.
Do you think it will be it will make maintaining the framework easier if ng modules are optional?
I don't think it's really going to change a whole lot in terms of maintenance. Reason being that currently the compiler is essentially doing this anyway. Its job is to look at the ng modules, figure out the whole structure, and basically for each component, figure out what its dependencies are and write them out explicitly. So if you start in an ng module and say, these are my explicit, or sorry, in a component, and have some way of telling it, these are my explicit dependencies, you just save the compiler a ton of work, really. It doesn't have to go and figure that out from the ng modules. You've just told it up front what those dependencies are. There's some challenges with how providers work in this whole scenario. That's been a really like big design point that we've had to try and figure out. I think we have a solution that we feel comfortable with. But again, we're solving each of these little problems, and then we're going to put the whole design together, probably do like an RFC to everybody, and try to answer the question, like, is this worth it, right? Is this actually going to create a maintenance headache for us, or is there enough value here to justify having a new concept? And that remains to be seen. So the real answer to your question is we don't yet know.
I think the question is it worth it dropping a concept?
Yeah, we're not going to be able to drop ng modules.
No, but for new applications, you can drop the whole module thing, and that means it becomes easier for people to learn the thing.
If we can make it so an application developer does not have to encounter ng modules and how to write them until they've kind of gotten familiar with the rest of how Angular works and how components works, I think that's a win.
Exactly.
I just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions. What about lazy loading when it comes to optional modules? Aha. So there's another project somewhere on our backlog. I'm not sure if it shows up on the roadmap yet or not, talking about fine-grained lazy loading. So basically being able to lazy load a component instead of only doing lazy loading through the router. And the interesting thing is that with Ivy, this does work today. You can use ES dynamic import to grab a component. You can then do a little component factory resolver dance to get the ng factory, which in Ivy is just kind of like a facade, and throw that at a view container ref and create a component from it. Works just fine. The problem is, what a lot of people don't realize when they do lazy loading through the router is the router is actually creating an injector from the ng module that you lazy load. And it's using that injector to get the route token, but it's also using that injector as kind of the injector for the components that get rendered into the router outlet. And that guarantees that if those components are in ng modules that also have providers that they need to work, that those services that are being provided will be available when the route component is created. And you don't get this for free, or you don't get this automatically if you just try to like reach into a lazy bundle, grab a component and render it, right? You may get that component and you may ask Angular to create an instance of it, but when Angular tries to like dependency inject the component, it'll ask for a service that won't be available because that service was provided in the components module and you didn't load the components module. You only loaded the component directly. And so optional ng modules or you know, components that don't have an ng module or aren't declared in an ng module does, I think, help address this problem somewhat, because the idea for a standalone component currently is that it's a component that is more or less independent, right? You're kind of declaring like this thing itself is self-contained. It has all of that. It references all of its own dependencies. You can load it and use it directly without necessarily needing to load any other kinds of providers or things in the background. There's no module that also, you know, augments what you need to use this component.
I saw a comment in the chat that you have to be an Angular compiler expert for Angular. And I just want to remind everyone, because this is my house and I'm your host here, and this is all completely free. And basically the only rule is be nice. So I don't know if that was meant to be snarky. It kind of looks snarky. And I want to remind you all, like, this is Angular Nation. We're talking. So if you don't like Angular, I don't know. Anyway, just be nice, and also avoid shameless self-promotion. Just a little house rules, because we have a lot of new people that have come in. And so I just want to remind everybody that Angular Nation, the vibe and the atmosphere is very, very important to me. And we're all very nice to each other here. So there has to be, we have to have a little etiquette, especially as we get bigger and bigger. And I don't expect anybody to be perfect, but I think the bigger we get, the more the etiquette becomes important. So just a little reminder for everybody. And I think that we are just about out of time. I think that I speak for all of us, Alex, when I say that we would totally stay here and hang out with you all day long and nerd out with you, and you could stay with us, and nobody's leaving until you leave. But I'm assuming that you have other work to do, and I know that it's morning over there and you have other things to do. So I really want to be respectful of your time.
He's in our time zone.
Yeah, he's in our time zone. Sorry, Angular team, we've got him. So I do want to be respectful of your time. You are absolutely welcome to go long. You do not have to stop at the top of the hour. Trust me, we're not leaving if you want to stay. But if you do want to go, I want to give you the opportunity to have any closing thoughts or let us know. If you don't have a hard stop, that's fine too.
I do unfortunately have a hard stop because I have meetings that are coming up in California. My team has been nice enough to schedule some really early meetings to not push me too late here. So yeah, but I can hang out probably for, you know, at least 10 more minutes. I think that's fine.
All right. Are there any final thoughts that you would like to, hold on, we have another question. Rainer has a question.
Yes.
And then we'll go back for final thoughts.
Yes, so Alex, in which cases would you recommend to use modules and not go with the optional modules once they are available?
Interesting question. I personally think that for anyone developing reusable components, things like you know, if you're publishing a library to NPM, for example, that you want other people to use, it makes sense that the entry point to that will always be an ng module, or should be. I think it's a good model for users too, that like when they reach into such a library, they know automatically, like, I need an ng module that's going to represent the components that I want to use. I don't think, like, at least our current designs have not focused on libraries as a use case, so I don't think they'll be particularly good in that area yet. The same goes for kind of if you're building an application that has optional or has like it's big enough to have its own like internal library of UI components. Like there are cases where you're offering a curated experience to some other part of the application, a set of components that works together, you know, directives that are all needed in the same context, where it makes sense to bundle these things. So I think the right place to start using them right now is just like these kind of business logic components that are kind of the bread and butter of an application.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, plenty of time. I want to. Manfred posted the when question in the chat, so I'm surprised it took that long to get there. Not in 13, almost certainly not in 13. You may see an RFC by then, but we're not really tied to the release for that, so who knows? I think that's all I can really say about the time frame. Like, we don't know. We're still designing the thing. I'm not even sure you'll see them ever, honestly. Like, it may be that the outcome of this is more trouble than it's worth to solve all of the problems that we would need to solve and still offer something valuable.
All right.
And maybe the way the constraints overlap, there's just no solution that fits that space. Maxime.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So you did mention before that you didn't want to commit to any, syntax for this, for this isolated component architecture that you're proposing. Sorry, I'm forgetting what you were calling it. Standalone component. Sorry. But I would assume that most of what you would be adding here would be sitting in the component decorator, or do you have any other kind of wild ideas?
There are plenty of wild ideas. Adding fields to the component decorator is one way to do it. At standalone component would be another way to do it, having a separate annotation that's makes it clear that this is a very distinct thing. I've mentally played around with the idea of having an ng module decorator on the component as well. So 2 decorators that represent the 2 parts. I don't like that one for a few reasons.
I don't think anyone's going to go for that one. The promise here is to get rid of ng modules. If you shove that decorator on there, I'm going to be happy.
But there's a couple different syntaxes you could imagine. A lot of the discussion kind of revolves around how do we make these concepts explicit enough. We talk about things like, what happens if someone intends a component to be a standalone component, but accidentally adds it to an ng module? What is that experience like? What errors do you get? Does it actually, is the compiler able to figure this out? That kind of thing.
Yeah, your CPU fans start spinning, and after a while, smoke comes out of your computer.
Sandra, will you do it again? Because the people who are watching the recording later did not see what you did when Alex said that, but it was funny.
Yep. Exactly.
Thanks, Sandra.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah.
Alex, I think I speak for all of us when I say it would be really great if you come back and see us again. Please come back and visit. We have to do this more. This is so cool. I know you have actual work to do, but anytime, if you want to come and hang out and nerd with us, we would absolutely love. If anybody who agrees with that, anybody who wants Alex to come back, you guys raise your hands or come off mute and say thank you and give Alex some love. Look at that. Look at all the love.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Alex.
I have to go.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
Oh, I'm very happy to be here. I'll leave you with a little teaser.
Always nice to see everybody here.
Go ahead.
The meeting that I have to go to, unfortunately, that's why I have a hard stop today, is on designing strictly typed forms.
You have piqued my interest, sir.
Yay!
Come back and tell us everything.
Also,
I have
you
something
next
to
week,
say
Alex.
about forms, but I have the hard exit too, so...
All right, we're
come back
gonna
to
get
that.
Alex back on the calendar, you guys. Don't let me forget. Thanks again, Alex.
Well,
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
cheers.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye-bye.